Hello, and welcome to the View from Felaban preview. I'm Joy Macknight, Managing Editor of The Banker, and I'm joined by Economics Editor Silvia Pavoni, who'll be conducting video interviews with the movers and shakers at the event. The Felaban Annual Assembly will be held from the 2nd to the 5th of November in Hollywood, Florida, and the Banker magazine will be available to be picked up there. Silvia, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Joy.
So what would you say are going to be the hot topics at the conference this year?
So I think there are a couple of topics that will be certainly on everyone's minds. The global state of the economy. We've just heard the recent outlook from the IMF, so it's really all doom and gloom. And so certainly those bankers will be concerned about the implications for the region and their specific countries. There are also going to be talks about trade, I'm sure, and as you know, the EU and Mercosur, which is the customs union between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay, they've recently reached an agreement that covers about 90% of the existing trade, and in 2018 this was about the equivalent of over $100 billion, so quite a significant amount. And so, of course, there are expectations that this will increase exports. Brazilian officials expect that by 2035, the same amount, so 100 billion, will actually be the increase in exports from their country towards the EU. But although these really pave the way for greater growth and trade, and therefore also business opportunities for banks, there are question marks over the geopolitics of the whole thing. So we have President, again, focusing on Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who tends to be more of a nationalist rather than a liberal, pro-trade, pro-globalist. And so some fear that he may perhaps wish to even wait and delay ratifying the agreements in Brazilian law. So that's one of the points. Of course, again, staying in the geopolitical space, we are going to have elections in Argentina at the end of October, so just before Felaban will take place. We've had sort of a primary election in August, which actually gave a surprise win to the Peronist candidates and against the incumbent, Mauricio Macri. And so we're expecting actually Peronists to come back in power. What will that mean? We're not quite sure. International investors and markets and bankers perhaps are a little bit concerned. And of course, Argentina has been dealing with increase in poverty and increase in unemployment, and they have to deal with the largest bailout package that the IMF has ever granted, $57 billion, and being able to find the resources to repay this.
Okay, and is this reflected, all this reflected in what's in the Banker for the issue that's going to Felaban?
Of course. So we have a piece on what the EU-Mercosur agreement means for banks, in particular Brazilian banks. We also have, interestingly, a piece, and that's an element, this is a topic I haven't actually mentioned earlier, but the piece is about de-risking. So the fact that many international banks have severed relations with their Latin American counterparts because of various reasons, from regulation to wanted to reduce their international exposure and risk. And this has most worryingly hit Caribbean countries and banks. And so we have an article that looks at that. We also, of course, as every year, have our ranking of top 200 Latin American banks. So delegates at Felaban and anyone interested in Latin America can look at where these banks sit in the ranking. The Brazilians, of course, won't surprise anyone, are firmly at the top, but there are some other interesting figures and data about the rest of the pack. And we also have a very interesting opinion piece by the Central Bank Governor of Mexico, Alejandro Díaz de León, who tells us about the importance of central banks' independence and what that has meant for his country.
Okay. And then at the event, you're actually going to be chairing a panel, which is around the global economy. You touched on it just then, but what do you think will be, the main points of discussion on that panel?
So, of course, the global economic situation, what that means for Latin America. Latin America really hasn't fared particularly well in terms of economic growth. Again, the electoral cycle perhaps hasn't helped either, adding political uncertainty. In addition to Argentina, Uruguay will also go to the polls. With the results coming out after Felaban, and we've had a number of other countries, including Panama, that had a change of governments this year. So that will certainly be one of the points. Latin American banks, however, particularly in some countries, and Argentina actually being one of them, interestingly, tend to remain quite profitable. So in banking terms, again, there are pockets of high profitability, whether that may be to the fact that maybe there isn't too much competition, and maybe another contributor to this factor is that international banks again have kind of retreated a little bit when we think about the retail space. Although of course again there are many other opportunities when it comes to serving larger corporates, and maybe again going back to the international relations and correspondent banking side of things, although some of the big players may have cut down a little bit, if not completely exited their relations with Latin American Caribbean banks, some others may be interested in replacing them, whether from the States, for example, smaller banks, or whether even from within the region.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your insight, Silvia. Remember that you can pick up your copy of The Banker at Felaban in Hollywood, Florida.